All right, everybody. Hopefully, I've got my act together, and this will be probably the last live stream that looks like this anyway before the Christmas break. I am going to try some experiments without access to this beautiful studio that I have here. Have the ability to use sometimes. So I may try a different live stream between now and kind of the New Year's, that first week of January. But until then, this will be the last live stream that's scheduled like this, where we can have an Ask Me Anything event, and you can ask me questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. So Merry Christmas. I'm wearing my Christmas shirt here today, and got the Christmas colors here behind me. You can kind of see it a little bit better here. And we got the studio set up in a festive Christmas-oriented way, even though we're still a little ways off. So it's always a good time to appreciate the holidays. And if you're like me and you have kids that are away in college, you're always happy to have them back home. And you have kids that still aren't out of the house yet, too. It's nice to have them all together and to have everybody together all at once. If you do see me, I'm kind of planning to try to do a live stream in a little different setup, or at least some kind of a podcast sort of setup while I'm not in the studio. And I'm going to be trying some of that equipment that I have thanked Leonard Goodman for donating to me a while ago. So hopefully, Leonard, if you see me using it, and you can critique at least this initial stage of the process that I go through and trying it in a different location in a different way. But for today, I figured that I had this theme just oriented around helping people figure out how to catch corruption or identify corruption in local government and in state government, or just wherever you live. And so that was kind of the theme that I thought I'd have for tonight's broadcast. And I think a lot of it's just oriented around the fact that we're having this big transition at the federal level, obviously, between the Biden administration and the Trump administration, even though Biden's kind of already checked out. And frankly, it looks like Trump has practically taken over. It's the weirdest transition that I've ever seen at a presidential level. And so it's kind of unusual to see that happening in a modern time at such a world stage. But it brings us back to stuff that's going on at the state level and in our local communities. And I recorded a number of videos today. I'll be launching them over the next couple weeks. One of them just had to do with another one of the PACs that I caught breaking the law, missing money, failure to identify sponsorship, hiding max limit donations, and concealing source of funds. So classic violations. In that case, it was the Cowlitz County Cowlitz County Democrat Women PAC is what it was. I also caught the Cowlitz County Democrats breaking a law, but it was a little less significant a violation compared to the other one. And I've caught them breaking the law many times. The other videos, I had a video about just the presidential pardon process, and not so much about the Hunter Biden aspect of it, but the fact that in this massive batch of thousands of pardons or clemencies that the president Biden has issued, that he specifically pardoned a couple of really bad people that really genuinely don't deserve any kind of pardon or clemency of any kind at all. One of them was the former comptroller for the city of Dixon out in Illinois, and she had stolen $53 million, current national record actually, of municipal theft by a public official. And so she had stolen $53 million and was stealing millions of dollars from apparently the day she got into that position there in 1990 all the way up until 2011. And she was convicted in a jury trial in 2013 and was serving a home detention, but letting her go early was the wrong signal, I think, for the Biden administration to have, considering how usually when you're the record holder, public integrity sort of person who's simply destroyed all credibility with that process, there's no excuse for that. And that was a crazy story because that gal had been had used her money to have a record-setting show horse campaign, all these properties, houses in other states, lots of fancy cars, an exotic lifestyle, and she funded it all on the backs of the taxpayers in Dixon and wasn't caught for a long time, 20 years or so. So that was a pretty amazing story, but also a terrible person to give clemency to. The other one was the Cash for Kids judge out of Pennsylvania. who had been basically accepting bribes in exchange for sending juveniles to a detention center, and he was being bribed by the owner of the detention center. It was probably one of the worst, at least recent, judge bribery cases in America. Made a lot of news at the time. He was also convicted of jury conviction, I believe, back in 2011, and he committed most of the bribery and racketeering sort of violations in the early 2000s, essentially. And there were a couple other people that were also convicted with him, but he was the one that got the clemency. And again, I realize that nobody actually believes that Biden's in charge of anything right now, but and so he may not even be aware that these are the people that he gave clemency to. But the fact that it happened and those people made it through this list clearly shows there's nobody in charge or paying much attention to what's going on. The argument that they had as to why they did that particular batch, the 1,500 people that he gave clemency or pardons to that day, and that's the largest that have ever been issued, by the way. But the argument that they used is that they were taking people that had been released during the COVID era from jail and put in home detention, which was a dumb move in the first place. But we'll say that that was a decision that was made, and they put these people who were considered nonviolent offenders, and they put them at home, and they're on home detention. And after several years of being on home detention, serving out the rest of their sentence, they decided to give them clemency and say, hey, you haven't killed anybody or hurt anybody, so we'll kind of pardon you for the rest of your sentence. But in these two examples, they should have not been on that list. These are people who, in every way, were exceptionally egregious violators, even by the standards, low as they might be for public officials and elected officials. And there's really no excuse for why the Biden administration gave these people clemency. And so that's why it's made the news. And I talked about the significance of the presidential pardon powers and kind of the historical trend over time, and the types of pardons that have historically been issued from George Washington to Bill Clinton. And so anyway, it was that's one of the videos. And then I also did another story about those of you who've been paying attention to the COVID fraud, slow walking of the exposure of the COVID fraud, the fact that Thurston County, once again, makes national news, being first county in America to actually be required by the Treasury Department to refund the at least $668,000 of complete and total fraud that occurred on Thurston County's watch in the early days of the COVID kickback rental assistance scheme. $53 million flowed through Thurston County. It's federal taxpayer dollars you'll never get back. And of that, at a bare minimum, the 668,000 of it was so openly and outright fraud. People that didn't exist, addresses that didn't exist, landlords had never heard of these people. I mean, it was pretty bad, actually. And remember, that was run through a nonprofit that denied that there was any fraud going on at all. And still, apparently, I don't know if they still deny it to this day, but for months they were trying to deny it. And when it first came up in 2022, they were trying to make a big fuss out of the county shutting off these funds to them. And PBS kind of went along with them and made it seem like the county was being a miser. And, Thurston County is certainly not known for good governance. And if Thurston County caught you committing fraud, you had to be so blatant and so open and so obvious about it and incompetent that even Thurston County had to cut off the spigot there. So that's pretty bad. And that story has made it. It's really been an ongoing story. It started in 2022 when it kind of was first exposed, and this nonprofit was clearly not doing much of a job of vetting anything. And then it was this August when the Treasury Department demanded the money back. The county kind of appealed it. They gave some money, about $250,000, I believe, and then they were appealing the rest, and then the Treasury Department came back and said, no, you have to pay all $668,000. Doesn't come out of your insurance risk pool. It comes out of the general fund. So that's straight up money that the taxpayers are paying for nothing except for fraud and incompetence and bad behavior on the part of Thurston County. Now, Thurston County probably will be able to claim that they're not alone, which is probably true, as more counties also end up being dinged by the same program as the feds claw back the most obvious fraud as part of the trillions of dollars they kicked out there. But there were billions of dollars of money, taxpayer dollars, that were stolen, and I'm not sure how many people they're actually going to catch who stole that money. So let's get to the Ask Me Anything today, and I will jump in at some point in time and start talking about basically helping. I'll walk through some tasks or some ideas about how to catch fraud or how to identify corruption where you live, give you some ideas of places to start as far as how you look at that and look for it, I should say. So, at some point in time, I'll probably segue a couple times into that kind of a conversation, since it is the headline for today's live stream. And I just wanted to kind of recognize, since this is my last live stream for a couple weeks, at least in this format, then, I'll try to get to all your questions that you send my way. Now, the one thing I want to point out again is that it'll be comments like this down below. And when I go to your comment or question, in this case, this is a comment, but when I go to your question, I'm going to be reading your question and then trying to answer it or do my best to answer it. You can ask me anything. It doesn't matter whether it's on the topic that I have identified or not, but I will try to have it down below while I'm responding to it. Now, it very well may be that I go entirely off topic, but I will do my best to try to answer it. It also makes it a little bit easier. Usually when I've done these, the volume of questions start to really escalate, especially as the show goes along. And it's easier for me to pick questions out of the list. If you say at We the Governed, I can pick up on it a little bit better. It just makes it a little bit easier for me to spot those. So if you say at We the Governed, usually it shows up. I'll show you what it kind of looks like. It looks like this. So that type of visibility is a little bit easier for me to see as I'm kind of going through these comments, because a lot of times what people are doing is they're pointing at each other and commenting to each other, which is fine. But it's a way for me to pull up questions so that I can get to those. And that especially is important as things tend to get busier as the show kind of progresses. There's actually four, Elizabeth, you kind of put in about like three comments and then a question. So I'll just post up your comments, and then I'll get to the question here, because I believe that your comments, you're intending for those to be a little bit of background to the question that you're asking. So again, that's your comment here about my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, i.e. lack of knowledge of laws, bylaws. Adams' philosophy of government summarized with the critical sentence, a government of laws and not of men. That's true. This philosophy emphasizes an unbiased system of governing, no favoritism because of status relationships, political cronyism, etc. And it was admirably a governing by law, not of man. That was the theory. And then the culminating in a question. What is the role of a parliamentarian and a grand jury? Who is in charge of activating these roles? Is there incentive not to ask? And I am believing, because of the context of the question that you're asking me, that you're probably doing this because you recently went to a reorg meeting somewhere in Washington State, maybe the GOP, since that's going to be probably the most likely group of people watching this show. And you either didn't like how they ran the Robert's Rules of Order there, or how the parliamentarian ruled on certain questions, and therefore it's making you go back and question everything. Now, a little just kind of, I don't know, trivia, I guess, for lack of a better way of describing this. But most of the time, most states, the state legislature, they tend to operate under what's called Robert's Rules of Order. And generally, it goes back a long time. This is basically how to have an orderly meeting when you're trying to have people participate in a process of a group of people getting together, and you're trying to come to decisions and conclusions, and you want there to be an open input from the people who are participating. And rather than have it be a rowdy, who can yell the loudest kind of thing, you have rules that are set up to process it. Robert's Rules of Order are one of them. Now, what a lot of people don't know is there were actually competing rules of order back in the day. One of them was Reed's Rules of Order. And guess which state in America is the only state that actually uses Reed's Rule of Order rather than Robert's Rules of Order? That's right. You guessed it. It's Washington State. And so if you want to know, technically, at least the baseline, they may modify it a little bit, which both rules allow. The Reed's Rules of Order is actually how the legislature operates, and Robert's Rules of Order pretty much the most common, the one that people are most familiar with. So point of order, call to question, the motion is second, discussion, yays, nays, standing up, all that kind of stuff. If you've experienced that recently and you become slightly exposed to that, that's probably what your question is. So then the question that you're asking here is, what's the role of a parliamentarian? In most cases, the role of a parliamentarian in that setting is going to be the person who's kind of ruling on a question as to what's proper order under Robert's Rules of Order. Now, remember, you can suspend the rules. Again, it requires a certain percentage of voting. There's a number of different things. I am not an expert on Robert's Rules of Order. I'm reasonably capable of following a basic structure of Robert's Rules, but and I had to, when I was on the school board for 5 years, we generally, I can't say we were super consistent always in how we did it, but I always thought there was a basic process you really wanted to try to stick to and be consistent and predictable and allow people to be engaged and involved in it. And a parliamentarian is essentially trying to be the person in there who's saying, no, this is the way you need to do it, go back and fix that, or that person's correct, their point of order is appropriate for this, or that's already been settled, whatever the decisions are. In theory, the parliamentarian there is just to make sure that you're following the rules, and they're supposed to be even-handed because they're focused on the rules being followed, not necessarily the person who's pushing them. So I was at the Thurston County Republican reorg meeting on Saturday, which is where I live in Thurston County, and it was funny, I completely screwed up. I thought I had filed to run as a PCO. I really did. I've done it so many times, and all I can think of is I'm thinking back to May, and I must have gotten confused with the two Bob Fergusons drama, which was going on around the same time, but I still should have filed my PCO form before that, and I guess I didn't. So I was not a PCO, so I didn't really participate. I just sat there as an observer, and I thought that they followed protocol really well, actually. And Thurston County is generally pretty good at doing that, mainly because the factions in Thurston County, and every group has a faction, that are not in power, usually using Robert's rules quite a bit or demanding that they go back and do things in a certain way. And so that's disciplined, I think, the leadership in the Thurston County Republicans to be pretty solid at just walking through these rules and doing things the way that they're supposed to do them. And when questions come up, there's a lot less drama. There was a lot less drama than I've seen in other counties where I sat through this torturous process before, and where there's confusion and people are arguing about what the proper way of doing it. So anyway, it's just a funny, not funny. I mean, listen, it's important, and I don't mean to diminish it in any way at all. I do go back to this, though. I had a video that I did put up a while ago about how to run not a boring meeting, but just how to run an effective meeting if you're trying to grow your organization. That's very different than the reorg meeting that many of you who are watching this might have actually gone to recently. And that is that the last thing you want to do if you're trying to attract new people into your organization, you don't want to have a meeting where you're having extensive discussions or debates about Robert's Rules of Order. Now, that might surprise some people out there, but if you bring new people in, they're going to experience that torture, and they're going to say, gosh, I don't want to be here. Even as necessary as it is to do things like bylaw changes or platform modifications or electing critical decisions, you're going to have to follow that kind of requirement, approving the treasurer's report and minutes and things like that. But you separate those types of meetings away from having interesting meetings where you bring in speakers and there's Q&A with the audience and there's involvement talking about policies or issues or activities or whatever the content is, and you're socializing and things like that. That's what people usually want to come to these meetings for if they're new. And it takes a little bit more experienced people who want to stay engaged in the other stuff. And so sometimes you're better to separate those out. And this isn't even a partisan thing. I mean, the best guy that gave the presentation about how to not do a boring meeting was the former Dwight Pell's the chair of the Democrat Party when I recorded it at one of their crab feeds. I didn't go because they would have thrown me out, but I sent somebody else to go and record it, having no idea that that's what he's going to talk about. But he actually did a great job, and he was completely right. So it was helpful just to have that information to think about it. and you realize that his suggestions, which were sound, apply. It doesn't matter what party you are. It doesn't matter actually what organization you're in. There's a basic approach to how to run meetings in a way to grow your group or to how to run meetings in a way to shrink your group. And even if those are both tasks that you are required to have, you really want to separate those out quite a bit so that somebody who just wants to go there for the social side of things and expand your organization over there, or your group or your political movement or whatever you're trying to do, you want to have those separated quite a bit. So anyway, sorry we went off a little bit there, but I thought that was interesting. Gas addict. The question you have here is, how do you get authorities to investigate misuse of funds for a public hospital in the middle of the state? Good question. And you can't force authorities generally to do anything, but you can motivate them to look into potential fraud or theft of funds or basic corruption or whatever it is that you think is going on. Here's what you need to do. If you, let's just say that you have Hospital District A that you believe something nefarious is going on with, you need to get to the bottom of it as best you can. Now, if it's a public hospital, a lot of information is available to you to dig into expenditures and approval, misuse of, or use of funds, I should say, how they're using their funds and their budgets and all that stuff should be pretty public. However, what's hard with hospitals is under HIPAA laws and other restrictions that they can't give out information that would allow you, and this is understandable, they can't give out any information that would allow you to have patient level data that would let you know that your neighbor Mrs. Jones is going in for an appendicitis or a broken leg or something, or that she's on 3 different medications. They can't give you information that would allow you to come to identify some of that level of granular detail regarding somebody else's medical records. And this kind of has to do with the informed consent process and everything else. However, let's just say that you really want to expose something that's going on there. You can't just be flailing your arms around saying there's corruption, there's corruption. People come up to me all the time with stories like that. There's corruption, there's corruption. And they might be totally right, but you have to put together some baseline evidence to justify your belief that something is actually wrong. And you want to do that even for yourself. You want to do some level of investigation so that in order to encourage an official investigation of the corruption, that they've already been given enough information where they look at it and they say, okay, there's definitely something to see here. The video, I think I mentioned earlier about this gal that was arrested after she stole $53 million in the city of Dixon. Now, obviously, she should have been caught before then. They're clearly, as the comptroller herself, she probably was concealing the theft of funds. It's similar to the old Franklin County story from a number of years ago where the public works director was stealing money on a regular basis. And once they bake their theft into the budget, sometimes it's amazing how long they can do that without getting caught. I wonder how many situations like that are going on right now in our state. And the size of our state, I guarantee you there's a bunch of them. As we speak, as you're listening to me, as you're watching this video, I guarantee you there are hundreds of people working in government in our state and local positions all around the state that are actively right this minute stealing money. They're not getting caught yet, maybe, or some of them are in the early stages of getting caught because they're not very sharp or something, they slipped up somewhere, and the impact that's they're going to discover that they're under investigation or they get arrested. But most of the time, I think they're probably getting away with it, and they've gotten away with it for a while. And most people that are caught for stealing money or taking bribes or grant grifting operations that are illegal, most of those people survive audit after audit after audit of the state auditor's office. They do. They get away with it oftentimes for years, sometimes decades. And when they actually get caught, it's usually just an accident or an insider that turns on them or disgruntled employee or something. That's what happens. So to get those people, whoever you would have that should be investigating misuse of funds in a public hospital, requires you to do your homework and put together the evidence that you believe you have that shows that there's some misuse of funds or corruption. And the one thing to remember is my definition of government is a mountain of corruption that's concealed by an ocean of incompetence. And so the hardest thing in investigating government is to distinguish the boundary between the everyday, average, typical, normal incompetence that exists in every flavor and aspect of government, and where it crosses that boundary and it actually becomes hardcore corruption. The Cash for Kids scandal, that judge out of Pennsylvania taking bribes, cash bribes, and then trying to hide them, but taking cash bribes in exchange for sending the kids to a juvenile detention center that they didn't need to go to. That's obvious, right? It's pure bribery. But in order to uncover that, that took years of trying to figure out why this judge was overcharging these kids and what the relationship was between that judge and the people who were giving him cash. So there's some of those things are very hard to uncover separately, and it just takes a lot of work to do that. So it's not an easy process. Thank you for asking that question, but if you wonder how to start figuring out what is it that you think they're doing illegally, what's the evidence that supports your belief that they're doing something illegal, what are the laws? You may not necessarily know the exact statute, but what are the laws you believe that they're violating in their illegality, and who else would back you up on that? Who else has observed something similar? It's much easier if there's a group of you that can come in and present it to whoever the investigative body would be. In our state, I would generally start, if it's actual theft of funds and stuff, you could start with your local prosecutor and then go from there, see what your prosecutor says. And but a lot of times, one of the hardest things is if you're an outsider citizen trying to collect this data and submit it to proper authorities, is it's not a two-way information street. You're generally presenting information to them, and then it becomes a black hole. It's not so much that way with ethics violations or with campaign finance violations through the Public Disclosure Commission. They'll at least give you a little bit of, you can tell that something's going on, and you can actually get records on that information. But otherwise, it can feel like you're just dumping information one way before you hear anything back on it. The recent fraud investigation case out of Thurston County, where the Treasury Department's demanding $668,000 be returned to them from the fraudulent misuse of funds by Thurston County with their rental relief program under COVID. That took, even from discovery, it still took 2 years. And the government never goes fast, right? So that's one of the problems that you're going to feel like when you're dealing with investigators. Good question, Gas Addict. Thank you for doing that. Deb, very simple question here, and very easy, not an easy one to answer, but it's a simple question. How do we flip the state? Well, I'm going to modify my answer to you on this a little bit, because you're basically asking, how do you change the political culture in the state of Washington so that you're not electing crazy lefty Dems and you're trying to elect, say, conservative Republicans? That's the most idealized answer to that question. I'm assuming that that's kind of where you're trying to go. There's actually several steps you take en route to having that kind of an outcome. And there are things that have to be done simultaneously in order to ensure that you get to the point where that becomes a potential, just judging on the last couple of election cycles. Now, part of it is, you've heard me talk about federal election reform. And if the Trump administration genuinely follows through on federal election reform plans or claims that that's a high priority for them, and I believe that it is for some people there, but they're relatively close-lipped about how they're going to implement it, who's going to implement it, et cetera. However, let's presume that they believe that and they're going to actually pursue it, and I hope they are. The biggest obstacle for us in that process is probably going to be conservative Republicans from deep red states, because they're clueless about the problems that actually exist in the election process, and because they don't see any problem where they live, they aren't aware of just how significant the election decay in the election system has really become around the country. So they're least likely to have a sense of urgency, because it's not going to affect them in Oklahoma or Texas or Alabama or West Virginia, right? They aren't aware of how significant it is. And yet federal election reform will have a big impact if it has about 6 of the policies that I mentioned in a previous video. Summarizing those up is basically no more mail-in voting outside of very limited, very controlled sort of circumstances, deployed military or pre-approved, travel at that point in time, making Election Day a holiday so that for federal holiday so that everybody could go and vote on that day. Having same-day voting and counting and resolution that night on, or early in the morning anyway, on who actually won the election, so it's not drug out forever. Having regular voter registration process every 4 years or so, just like you do with the driver's license, so that you can actually guarantee those people still live there, they're still actually there, instead of the screwed up, half marginal, low quality job that we do currently in most elections in most parts of the country. Making sure you have ID and proof of citizenship when you do register, and that when you actually vote, you also have to bring proof of citizenship or ID with you, so that they can verify that it's actually you and that you're the one voting and that you're on the voter rolls and everything matches up. And then no electronic voting machines, which really has more of an impact in some of the East Coast states and Midwest states than it does with us on the West Coast. The biggest significant impact there isn't that it doesn't change. Where it really impacts us is in the voter rolls, in my opinion. The voter rolls right now are filled with a lot of crufty, non-existent, absolutely fake people. They call it ghost voters, phantom voters, whatever you want to call it. And you can't get them off the voter rolls no matter how much you prove that that person flat out doesn't exist. And frankly, that's why you have stories like what Como News, who accidentally committed an act of journalism just this fall, where they reported on the lady in King County that got 16 ballots delivered to her apartment or to her house there, and she didn't know who any of the 15 people were. She got hers, but then 50, these other 16 ballots. What the heck's going on? And that is an indication of a substantially flawed and problematic voter roll. There is no good way to explain that. Como News missed kind of the element of that story, but so that's one, is fixing the federal election reform. If they do it in the next 6 to 8 months or so, in time for the 2026 elections, I do think you'll see a big change in some of the elections. That by itself, by the way, doesn't necessarily mean suddenly Washington State becomes Republican and wins the governor's race. That's not how it works. But you probably would see a couple 100,000, maybe 400,000, up to 400,000, just fake, non-existent phantom voters disappear off the voter rolls. And that includes what they call inactive voters, which the problem with inactive voters is they are an absolutely fake phantom voter that sits out there in the wilderness. You don't see it on the voter rolls, but then suddenly a ballot comes in and they're instantly on the voter rolls. That's a problem that we definitely have, and we've just opened these doors to potentially fraudulent activity that goes on. And it's not like we haven't caught people in Washington State before. Acorn was caught and found guilty back in 2008 of trying to falsify thousands of voter registrations, and they just were caught red-handed because they were too cheap to pay the guy $10 an hour at the Seattle Public Library, and where they were basically fraudulently creating all these fake voter registrations. And I mean, who knew the public library in Seattle could be used for more than just shooting up meth? And so when they caught him, right, they gave him a $5,000 fine and a wrist slap, go and sin no more. And of course they said, oh, this has never happened before. We've never done this before. It's just, obviously nobody really believes that, except that's the fiction that the media and the Democrats have with something like that. And just a little hint here, all those fake voter registrations were not going to vote Republican, just in case you didn't realize that. So there's substantial benefit that you would get from cleaning up the voter rolls. Now, part of it would be, and it's not the biggest part actually, some of it would also be that we are registering non-U.S. citizens to vote in Washington State, and we're registering them in Colorado and Oregon and California and Nevada and Arizona and probably other states as well. Even if you're in a deep red state, I promise you probably are doing the same thing there. But if we have this process for voter registration, it will help keep those rolls much cleaner, much more honest, and will allow us to have a more accurate assessment of the voting outcomes without the ability of outside groups or organized efforts to influence elections by basically getting a hold of not real ballots or buying ballots from somebody for $30 and filling it out themselves and sending it in, or whatever other games that have been going on out there that we only occasionally catch little glimpses of here and there. And our county auditors want to pretend like it's not happening, and nobody's going to be willing to look or check or verify anything. And this would allow us to actually fix that. Now, that would probably, I don't know, that changes and flips Washington State. What it probably does is would help you have the opportunity to actually flip Washington State. First, though, you have to have Republican candidates that don't need a drool cup in order to function in a public setting. Your best bet would be to run people with a long-established community history and demonstrated track record of caring about the community and being involved and engaged in the community, and then also run a election campaign that's above kindergarten level, certainly above the level that most of the Republican consultants in Washington State typically run them at right now. That's not super easy. Those two things, again, you have to find serious people willing to who are willing to set aside their life to some extent. Because if you're a capable, competent Republican candidate, you probably have resources and you're successful in your life in some way. And so it's difficult to step back from that and make that sacrifice to run for public office. And you have to set aside years essentially to plan, prepare, dedicate your time to reaching out there and running a really aggressive marketing campaign. And you can't pretty much trust you really can't trust the insiders who exist here now, because their track record's terrible, their competency is low. And I can't blame them entirely, because a lot of these consultants, what a terrible job to have, or even campaign manager. It's a feast or famine cycle. So you're either making the big bucks on one year when it's a presidential cycle, and presumably there's more candidates who have deeper pockets to pay you, and the next year you make nothing. And then the year after that, in the midterms, you make a little bit. And so imagine trying to base your financial future, assuming you're going to be professional and not a clown, around that kind of an income cycle. It's very hard, and most of them don't necessarily have a side job that they can just walk away from for a year and then come back to it, right? That's hard. So I'm very critical of consultants and campaign managers in general because of the stuff I see out there, but at the same time I have to be aware of the environment that produces that kind of situation where you have so many people that are that incompetent, and understanding that competent people probably don't want to work in that kind of setting. And you're going to ask me, well, how do the Democrats do it? Well, they do it because the party isn't who does anything over there. Most of it's done by these outside leftist organizations that keep those people employed full-time, always doing something. They may be part-time consultants over here on this for a while, and they also have other jobs, grant grifting or stealing from the taxpayers in some other way. The left is really good at creating that ecosystem to support a kind of an army of campaign people full time all the time. But part of it, they spend a lot more money. So Republicans don't need to match Democrats dollar for dollar to win, but they still have to have some basic competency things set up. And you can't judge a competent Republican candidate by how crazy or nutty the Democrat is and say, listen, that candidate is a complete and total clown. He's a weirdo. He's nuts. I'm better than that. That isn't enough. You have to be substantially better than that. So it's not just being a little bit better. You really have to have a skill set that's pretty high out there. And I've done other videos about that I would encourage people to watch if you're interested in being a candidate and running for office. And you got to take it. I've run for office. I know what it's like to lose. I know what it's like to win. I know what it's like to help on campaigns. I've spent a lot of time out there. I know what it's like to train people to run for office. And I've helped train a lot of people that have been quite successful. But, you start also running, if you've just decided to come to politics, running for governor right out of the gate's probably an unwise approach. Your best plan would be to probably run for a lower office first and work out some of the bugs in the system that you're probably not aware of exist, and also build up your skills as a candidate and campaigner. But it's a tough road to start to pick to go down if you've got a successful background in almost any other field. So it's a real labor of love and desperation to some extent about, well, I've really got to fix this problem. And if I don't, my kids are going to be in the utopia nightmare that the left always creates. So, you have incentive structures you've put together to decide you're going to run for office. Let's see, jumping down to the next question. Good question. I think I answered that question well enough, Deb, but let me know if you think I've missed something. Thunderstriker back with us again here. Question number one, what did you think of Trump's news conference today? To confess, I didn't watch it, don't know anything about it, didn't see a thing, and the reason for that is that I was actually doing video prep today, so I don't have any opinion on it because I'm ignorant entirely about it. I'm sure I'll hear about it later on. Jack Palder, thank you so much. Got another question here. What's your take on the hate crime and ammo requirement fiasco floating around the Capitol? I don't know how serious either one of those are going to become. I need to study up on them a little bit more. I've been hearing a lot of discussion about it, and I've recently talked to half a dozen legislators in the last couple weeks, and this is silly season because all these early bills are getting filed now. Listen, it's a good time to file an early bill, but and so they all pile up. And you have to remember, there are a lot of goofy bills that get filed by legislators that don't have a chance in heck of they're virtue signaling bills, essentially. So you have crazy mouth-foaming leftists and organizations on one side, and you're a Democrat. Imagine being in that position. You're going to have to appease them in some way, and so you throw in bills that they essentially write for you. They hand you these bills. This is the bill I want. Most bills, by the way, are not written by the legislators. Now, when a bill that is written by somebody else, typically, goes in and is submitted, it goes through staff. Both the Democrats and the Republicans use theoretical nonpartisan staff. I just say theoretical, but they're supposed to be nonpartisan staff, and they essentially, the code revisor and stuff, they fit the bill into the format that legislation has. It's like a style structure. When do you use the word must? When do you use shall? What's the language structure that you put something in? I mean, I'm being simplistic with it. And I don't think that they're really that competent about it, but they at least try to go through this process before that bill gets out there and you see it as a pre-filed bill. The other thing to remember is that there's very few ideas that are genuinely new under the sun. Any conservative idea that you generally would have if you were to go in there, or a libertarian idea, or a crazy socialist nut job idea, when you go in there, most of those bills have been written at some point in time in the past. So sometimes elected officials will go, or representatives or senators, they'll go to the staff and they'll say, do we have a bill that's been addresses a growth management act or rent control or whatever, whatever idea it is that you have, and they'll, dust off an old bill that, 3 sessions ago was drafted up, and they'll look at it and maybe modify it to fit whatever that elected official said they wanted. And there's certain they can't do an unlimited number of bills, I don't believe, but and they kind of throttle the number of bills that can come from any specific legislator, and bills have a better chance of actually getting a hearing if you have bipartisan support. So a lot of the Democrats they'll find the weakest Republican they can find in the caucus, and the one that's most desperate to pretend like they're bipartisan, and they'll get them to sign on stupid bills that they in turn sometimes change completely from the original draft, and they have it modified when it goes out. There's all kinds of games they play in the legislature, and I can go into that. I'm kind of interested this cycle, if I can do it. I want to do some stories. I don't know if I'm going to be able to logistically put this together, but I would like to go do stories more about some of this process and what's going on, like from the legislature, and explain that a little bit so people it takes a little bit of the mystery out of it, I think, which is important. But we'll just have to see if I can get around to doing that. Let's see. Right, TZ Burton, this is a good question here. TZ, thank you for asking this question. Concerning pre-filed bills, SB 5038, clarifying hate crime offenses. Yeah, can you clarify the constitutionality of free speech suppression bills? We're not the UK. That's true. Yeah, they're completely unconstitutional. The very concept, to some extent, really what we're seeing here is the momentum of a bunch of Democrats in our state that thought Biden was going to not Biden, they thought Harris was going to become the next president. And so, assuming that they were going to have the nightmare in D.C., they're pushing, they had these ideas, these bills were drafted up years ago in some cases, and so they thought, okay, we're going to run with it. Well, they still have Ferguson, so they think they're going to run with it because they got big dollar donors that are going to give them money for proposing the bill, even if the bill doesn't have a chance of getting out of committee or going anywhere. A lot of these bills are not going anywhere. They aren't. I don't know which ones will actually come through. It would help the Republicans if they had a few more seats in both houses, because we'd be much easier to fix a lot of these issues, but we'll see what happens. I don't see that bill actually going too far, and if it does, I'm first on the list. Absolutely guarantee you I am first on the list. It could be Brandy Cruz, Ari Hoffman, Jason Rance, some of us, any local person that's actually been bothering to actually expose the truth about corruption in the state government you're the ones they want to silence first, and that's what they'll probably focus on trying to do. Michael Case, good question here. With Inslee leaving office and Ferguson taking over, will it still be possible to expose their knowledge and involvement in the Chop Chaz situation? Well, number one, remember, Ferguson knew everything and did nothing, so his involvement's pretty easy to understand. He just flat out abandoned his responsibility and decided to just throw it to the wind. After all, he knows that the left is who controls and directs him, and that's where his big dollars come from. So he didn't do anything. Now, Inslee, he pretended he didn't even know it was happening, if you remember that, for the first day or so, which was idiotic that he actually said that, but he did. How much is that going to come out right away? I don't know. I mean, the bigger question was the missing, if you remember, the fines the city of Seattle paid for the destroyed public records of the fire chief and the mayor at the time, Mayor Durkin. Those were, it's funny, I want to say Mayor Dinkins. Gosh, I'm getting my New York City flashbacks to my college days there. But anyway, that's the kind of thing that, a lot of times this stuff comes out later. You always can expose that there's people on the inside, you have information, but I don't know how much more it's going to be exposed, so we'll have to see. And Robert Allen, not a question, but I am going to put this up anyway. Secure the elections, first and foremost, January 20th, shipping program I don't even know what you just said there. That's not clear enough. Watch your typos when you're typing these in, because I don't even know exactly what you're trying to say, but I do believe that you're trying to say that fixing the election system should be highest priority. I think it is too, but we'll just have to see what happens. I really am. I'm optimistic on one hand in the sense I believe that people want to do it. I'm also optimistic that for the first time in 50 years, roughly, people on the conservative, freedom-oriented side of the political spectrum are recognizing how significant elections and the process of elections actually are. Generally, years ago, when I was trying to do election reform sort of work, we had a voter integrity project at the Freedom Foundation when I worked there in 2011. It was left over from the Rossi-Gregoire fiasco, but it had kind of, there's little things that they'd got fixed and changed, but even back then, the Republicans didn't take it seriously. I think it hurt us that we had a Republican Secretary of State who didn't want change either, and so the Democrats and the Republicans kind of colluded to make sure that they didn't fix anything, and it was really a challenge to get anybody to care. And the reason why I was interested is I had been doorbelling in 2010, and I was going off the voter rolls that the county had, and I would go to these homes and nothing matched. I would go to a house and there's 10 people supposedly registered to vote there, but there's only one person and they aren't even on the list of the 10. And, I found this time and time again. It was so often that it became very difficult to even use the voter rolls as part of the doorbelling process. And so that made me more interested in what's going on with the voter rolls. Now, back then we didn't have the sophisticated database ability to access and manage large volumes of data the way that we do now. You bring in people that know how to do that, and that's how you start to find a lot of the problems and the strange anomalies that we found when we were doorbelling over the last couple of years. Question number 2, back for Thunderstriker again. This is about the latest incident at a Christian school in Wisconsin, and I did, of course, but here's the thing about this, and this is the question down below. Of course I heard about it. The issue is that the left will always try to turn these into an anti-gun agenda event, no matter what. Doesn't matter if it's Stockton, California from 1986. Doesn't matter if it's the bell tower, attempt on the, Texas University? I can't remember now for sure which college it was. I thought it was down in Texas back in the 60s. The assassination of Kennedy, that was used as an excuse to do gun control in America back then. No matter what you do, right, that no matter what happens, taking those tragedies and rather than trying to address the issues that actually exist out there, they're always going to come back and trying to say, how can we make people more vulnerable to crime? How can we make it harder for people to defend themselves? Can we make it so that they have to rely on us, the big government, to protect them, even though we fail every time we are put in that position? It's a real pernicious sort of approach to these tragedies. And I think that one is classic. I mean, somebody should be asking. I'm curious to see if that girl was on any medications. And that's been kind of a hobby horse of mine since the 80s. When the Stockton, California one happened, I was in high school at the time, but I remember the guy who committed that, who killed those kids with that firearm, he was actually on Social Security disability. And so he used his Social Security funds that he was collecting on disability to buy, he had this like psychotic medication that he was on, and he used his money then to go out and buy the rifle that he used to shoot and kill those kids there. Anyway, let's see. Elaine Lorimer, question here. Without putting yourself in harm's way, can you tell me if you think Bob Ferguson's win is legitimate? Well, I'm always in harm's way. Listen, as long as Ferguson's in office, right, everybody's technically in harm's way. To be fair, though, and I kind of think Ferguson's going to have his hands full a little bit in dealing with the Trump administration. And you got to remember, he's suffering from an extreme case of Trump derangement syndrome anyway. I'm sure whatever his grandiose plans were as governor, they're severely constrained right now because of the Trump administration's likely policies that are going to have an impact on Washington State, including but not limited to the fact that if there is federal election reform, removing illegal non-citizens, especially criminals here. Ferguson loves his criminals. He wants to keep them in the state at all costs, and deporting those people is going to cause a lot of heartache for Ferguson and his big donor class. Thirdly, you're going to have a Department of Justice that's not the same clown show that it's been in the past. I think they're going to be a little more aggressive on the public integrity side of things. Whether that hits Ferguson directly or not is yet to be determined, but I guarantee it's going to hit a lot of his political allies. And the investigations can be extensive, and nobody's really ever looked in Washington State, not for decades. And then also he's going to be dealing with similar lawsuits going after the state on civil rights violations that Ferguson seems to want to perpetuate, but I don't think it's going to be as easy for him to successfully implement those, considering the nature and how much people are paying attention to it. So I don't know. I don't think that. And then the question, really getting back to your question, whether his win is legitimate. Again, I think if we had federal election reform before this last election, and it was the policies that I mentioned, I don't know that Reichert would have won, but I guarantee you it would have been a lot closer. And once you get close enough to those margins, things start to change as far as how people fund campaigns and what they do. Let's see. Night Owl comment, but I'm still going to jump on this one. Now the Democrats want to get rid of her ability to vote for the sheriff. That's not good. That is a very difficult task for them to go down, because I think they have to make a state constitutional change. It doesn't really matter what they think. It would have to go before the voters, and I don't see that going anywhere. Now remember, if you're a home rule charter county, which has been part of the state constitution since 1949, you have the ability to modify your charter to go with a non-elected sheriff. Remember when they did that in 1969, I think it was 69, when King County shifted from commission to charter county, they went with a not elected sheriff. And then they switched back to an elected sheriff. And then they went to non-elected, and then they switched back to an elected sheriff, or non-elected. They went back and forth a couple times, basically, over the years. Recently, King County is the only county without an elected sheriff. Now, there's a lot of reasons why we don't want that, mostly because then the law enforcement, it eliminates the independence of that branch of government and ensures that it's essentially just a puppet for the elected officials, as the police chief is in most big cities. So there's some challenges there. Let's see, D. Rambo here, question. Do you think requesting a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, on our elected officials would be a good start, which is kind of like a background check? Okay, so let's get back to the core comment that I mentioned earlier about helping you catch the corrupt people in government. And there are some where you live, no matter where you are. And using public records requests, which is the actual way you refer to it at the state level. FOIA is actually referring to a federal Freedom of Information Act at a federal level. Public Records Act is the RCW .5354. Why am I forgetting that one? Anyway, when you file your Public Records Act request, it's not a question of whether you use that. The question is, what are you actually asking for? And I think there's specificity that you can use in your first Public Records Act requests that you have with your elected officials, and this would apply to city council or county commission or really parks department, port commission, school district, anything. One of the first things I would look for, because it just gives you a baseline to start with. First, you should be able to get the budget. It should be public anyway. Like, I don't think you have to file a records request for that. But you need to understand how much money that entity has and how it spends its money. And their budget's going to give you a tremendous amount of information and allow you to start shifting and focusing where you spend your time and what you focus in on. I would look for, if I didn't know anything and I'm just starting out somewhere and I moved to a county and I literally know nothing about what's going on, I'd pick my government entity that I care about and want to pay attention to. I'd file a records request for the calendar of the elected officials for the last year or two, any per diem payments that have been made to them. I would look for the travel, anything related to travel that they've been on, or senior bureaucrats in that jurisdiction as well. All that's going to be a public record in Washington State. And then I would also, at some point in time, get a copy of you'll call it check registry, they might call it vouchers, but you want a detailed voucher breakdown or check registry breakdown for a given month. I wouldn't get more larger than that until after you start to get a better sense of what you're looking at and what's going on in that community. I would also look for a sampling of contracts that they have with vendors. And I would also look for copies of contracts with nonprofits, because the grant grifting operations to the homeless industrial complex or the Greenies or whoever, which is a lot of pass-through funds that come through your local government, this is where the bodies are oftentimes buried, and this is where bad behavior is oftentimes conducted because nobody's really looking. The other thing I would do is I would go back and I would look through historic state audit reports on the county or the city. The state auditor's fairly useless when they do these, but every now and then they accidentally discover something that they have to do a report on, and you might find that there is some history there that's kind of useful. And then I would start looking for critics of your local elected official. You do not care what party they may affiliate themselves with. If they are a critic and they have some historical reference as to why they're a critic, they may have information you don't have and save you a lot of time because they've already filed those records requests. So you mine the area for that kind of information first. Honestly, if you did this the way I'm describing it within 6 months, especially if you attend meetings and you pay attention to what's going on there, you're going to start to have a pretty good picture of where you really need to deep dive. And that's before you get into doing things like recruiting whistleblowers and former disgruntled employees, whatever you need to do to start getting a better picture of the players and how, what's going on. If they are elected officials at a large enough entity, they should have filed public they're called F1 documents, financial affairs documents. I would pull those in the last 5 years from that elected official and see what it looks like. They have to file one every single year they're in office. Those are helpful pieces of information. And don't approach these situations with a bias that you know exactly what's going on, because you probably don't. But keep an open mind with the documents you get. 9 times out of 10, I went looking for one thing, and I found something that was way worse, or more interesting, or even better than I thought I was looking for. So, and then after that, you start looking at emails and cross-reference multi-jurisdictional correspondence. I mean, there's all kinds of other things you look at. But if you try to file records requests for everything, you don't really get anything that's useful. Narrow in, get the things you specifically are looking for, and then you can start to build a pattern. When you really think there's something bad going on, start putting together your RICO board, racketeering and organized crime, if you're familiar in law enforcement, but it's kind of like that. You're just simply trying to identify the players and understand how they all hook together. Most of the big fraud cases that have happened in the last say 15, 20 years in government usually involve multiple players. The big fraud, when you're stealing large amounts of money, sometimes you'll have cases where they've been able to, they wiggle themselves into a place where they're really able to do most of their theft and kind of criminal activity that's really open and blatant without anybody really noticing. But most of the time, there's multiple people involved. There's kickback schemes through nonprofits. There's people involved in that nonprofit are giving campaign cash to this person who's giving money to them. And sometimes what you find is just unethical. It may not be technically illegal, but it's unethical. Exposing the truth is a good step. So there's a lot of things, a lot of steps that you can look at there. I hope that was helpful because I tried to. That's kind of on topic today, and I'm trying to, as best I can, stay sort of on topic. Jason Fisher, do you think Justin Trudeau in Canada will be able to stay in power? Well, I actually think he's going to go down. And part of it's what's interesting, if you see what's happened in Germany and in France, and I think what will soon be happening in England too, there is a kind of a collapse of confidence in government, a deserved collapse in confidence in government, even the stable governments of the G7 or G20, where they feel like they're just able to kind of, even what's happened in South Korea, right, to some extent, a little different case there. But what happens is as they flounder through their incompetence, and people they can't hide a lot of these are people trying to push some kind of woke agenda, green agenda in Germany, misuse of funds, as you see in France, just egregious policies in Canada based on this globalist sort of approach to the world. You're going to have rebellions that push back against that. Not rebellions in the traditional leftist bring out the guillotine in rebellion, but rebellions like what you see in Argentina, which is truly an amazing case of an election having consequences that will be generational in a good way. And it's important that we see cases like that of a big, Argentina is not a small country. It's small compared to America, but it's a fairly significant country, and to eliminate inflation and the debt and all those government agencies so quickly, it should inspire hope for those who believe it's impossible to do anything in America. And I think at a national level, the next year or two is super critical here, because this Department of Government Efficiency, which I don't even like that term, but okay, it's not so much I want to make government more efficient. I really just want to downsize government substantially, because there is a zero-sum game. Bigger government is, the smaller my freedoms become. There is no way to look at it other than that. So you really want government to be a lot smaller, so I have more room to live and focus on just a couple of key things: protecting my rights, making sure we have a justice system, and that we have the ability to protect our country. Short of that, government does pretty much everything else really, really badly. So shrinking it down to that point is brutal, because there's and I've discussed this before on my channel quite a bit, the distributed cost, concentrated benefits challenge that you have with government and those people who feed at the trough of government. Again, they have the concentrated benefits, so for them, they will do anything to actually ensure they stay in power and they get their gravy train continuing to flow. Those of us who have to pay for that, sure, it's a tough tax burden perhaps, but it's really, you can still survive. That extra 2% increase your tax burden isn't enough for you to destroy your life trying to fix the problem, right? Or to take the abuse that they send back at you. Eventually, things get so bad that a lot more people are going to be involved in shrinking the size of government. And with Milei down in Argentina, it's interesting to see the success he's had. So we'll have to see where he goes. Thunderstriker, you're wasting your question here. I don't care about Mark Hamill's political view at all. It doesn't matter. Love Star Wars. Don't care about him. Don't care about any actors or actresses at all. Nothing that they have to say really matters to me, unless they're talking about how they prepared for a scene, because generally their opinions, people who wear makeup and pretend to be other people, and they're generally good at memorizing lines and putting on a facade, are hardly the people that I would want to base any kind of decisions on or really care about what they think. It's amazing to me that we spend as much time thinking about that moving forward. Let's see. Yes, this is a big deal. I agree, D. Rambo, on changing and eliminating the voter registration the day before you vote. It's ridiculous. Let's see. Oceana, 23, came late. Will you be at the Roanoke Conference, Glenn? And the answer to that is absolutely. I'm on the board of the Roanoke Conference. I've actually been on the board there since 2015, I think, is when I first got on the board. In fact, I think I'm one of the longest serving board members there. And I don't, I've been serving there a long time on that board. I like the conference. I love it mainly for the networking more than anything else. We spend a lot of time on the board making sure that we know who our speakers are, programming for the different panels and all this stuff. But the truth is, I think what people really get out of this is an opportunity for you and 649 of your favorite Republican friends, and maybe some people you don't like, all coming together at one time out at Ocean Shores, and the ability to network and compare notes, have little side meetings about projects that you want to do out in those communities. I mean, for me, I travel around the state all the time, so it's an opportunity to meet a bunch of people all at once in one place that I don't typically get. So for me, it's really, really important, and I view Roanoke as an amazing opportunity to network and talk to other people. The speakers, sometimes they're really good, sometimes they aren't as good. We do our best. It's not an expensive conference. It's remember, everybody on the Roanoke board, we're all volunteers. Nobody's paying us to be there, and it has a relatively high turnover on purpose because we're trying to bring in new people to get a little bit of exposure to running this program. And I'm very impressed historically with the people on the board, even if I disagree with sometimes I'll have board members that I actually politically am quite different from, I think. I view myself a little bit more as a activist, kind of grassroots-oriented guy. And so, when you have there's people on the board who I would be probably different politically from. They might be more on the mainstream Republican side, for lack of a better term, and than I am. Despite that, what I like about the board is that you can bypass those differences and just have an effective conference and do it well. And people in those situations matter more for their ability just to get the job done, check off the list, get those things organized, and whether we would come to the same agreement about whether we're, pro-life or our libertarian policies on this or that, or whatever other differences that might separate us. And so the ability to have a conference like that on a regular basis that's been going since 2009, I believe, is a big deal. And so it's useful, it's helpful, use it for what it is, and I hopefully, if you are there, please make a point of coming up and telling me and talking to me, and I look forward to seeing you there as well. Thank you for the green background. My guys like it here as well. Thank you so much for that comment. C.J. Dewey, I like this question down here. What about the small town corruption from both parties? Absolutely. Just because you're Republican doesn't mean you can't be corrupt. I mean, and that's true. I went after a bunch of Republican county commissioners one time that I felt were totally corrupt in Eastern Washington. Which county was that in? Douglas County, I guess it was a number of years ago. And I've gone after others a number of times specifically. But in Washington State, lest anybody forget, it happens to be run by the Democrats. I know there's a lot of people watching this video that may not be aware of that, but it actually is true. And so if you want to be corrupt, if you want to steal money or you want to be part of the grift, you basically need to get down and be good with the Democrats. That's where the big bucks is. That's where you're going to get the big cash flows coming from. And so it should be no surprise. It's partially just human nature. Democrats are going to be where most of the corruption exists. It's not because Republicans are perfect and angels. It's because they don't control any of the power at any significant level anywhere. Arguably, they may have nominal control of some county governments, some small county governments, some small cities, maybe some school boards here and there, and that's it. That's what the Republicans control. And if you haven't really figured it out, that's like comparing an ant to a bulldozer. There's probably some corruption in the anthill over there, but the bulldozer is where the big machinery of corruption exists. And so focusing on just the ants doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It just means you're not that serious about trying to deal with corruption, at least in our state. If you're in Oklahoma, you're in North Dakota, you're in Idaho, different story. The corruption you're going to find in those states, everybody's going to have an R next to their name. And it is the way it is. So people in power, money control power, that tends to be what dominates and controls people in government. The more people like that you can expose, the better off we all are. And I do believe that your freedom improves the smaller you shrink government so that it can be less intrusive and abusive, less money flowing through it, easier to keep an eye on it, and less opportunities for mischief. At least that's my approach there. C.J. Dewey, I would listen to you more if you would stop using derogatory terms for the left of center people here. Thank you so much. And you'll have to tell me what you think derogatory. I use Dems, I think, sometimes. But let me know what you think is derogatory about any terms I use. I try to be pretty accurate with it as best as I possibly can, so I appreciate your comment about that, and let me know. Author S.A. Stacy, I recently I'm assuming you mean heard, in a public meeting, $50,000 was raised by the Facebook group Recall Inslee. Is there any way to see how those funds were spent, for example, into somebody's pocket? Yeah, and I mean, that group, it was a couple years ago, and yes, you can look at the Public Disclosure Commission documents that they filed and see how they spent their money. There were also a number of PDC complaints filed against that group, if I remember right, and they had a lot of problems with tracking those funds based on what I read in some of those complaints and the responses and how they kind of muddled through things. Here was the weird thing that did come out of that I thought was interesting. There is a process that you can use when a candidate or a PAC is involved in an election where you have a 10-day window, used to be 7, but now it's 10 days, where you can actually go and look through their books or ledgers, for lack of a better term. Essentially what that means is you have that window of time, you can go in, usually it's in person, or if they're more sophisticated, they can send you digital copies, but usually it's in person. You look specifically for the bank printouts, receipts, contracts, a bunch of other things that don't show up in a PDC report filing. It's the same thing, actually, that the PDC staff, Public Disclosure Commission staff, can get if there's a complaint and they have to look into the books of the entity that they're looking at. But staff's not always that assertive or aggressive or consistent or even competent. So that opportunity to go and look at books will almost always result in if you're familiar with the statute, you'll find usually violations, especially if it's if it's kind of a half-assed sort of operation. And the problem that group had, that was interesting, is that the PDC indicated that because the group didn't have an election cycle they're attached to, that even if there was an election going on at that time, you couldn't look through their books. It's actually one of those little tweaks that I would fix in the campaign finance laws, where I'd make it so that you could go and look at their books after a certain period of time, so you could actually verify that they're representing things accurately or not. They did raise a bunch of money. I know about $10,000 of it at least was spent on an attorney. I don't know how they spent the rest of their money because I haven't looked. It's been quite a few years since I've looked at theirs, and I've looked at thousands of PDC reports since then. But that's an interesting. Destiny Armstrong, talk about snitch line law starting January 1st. That's for hate speech. That's concerning to me. Well, it should be concerning to you. It's absurd and deserves all the mockery that it's getting and should get and will always continue to receive. I am positive that I will be turned in day one of the snitch line opening on January 1st, 2025. And I'm sure that I'll be talking to whatever anti-constitutional clown show there wants to get sued. So I'll be curious about what how they actually go about approaching that, especially considering all the other things that are going to be rolling out this next year. We'll just have to see. D. Rambo, happy holidays. Just a suggestion for one of your future interviews. I am free. He is doing a great job to uncover corruption. Okay, yeah, I'll definitely look into that. Thank you for bringing that up, and I will make a point of looking that up as well. I'm always interested in local corruption, so we'll have to see where it's going. Let's see. Keep going down here. Reform Clark County, Rob Anderson here. Glenn, have you looked into creating an org or foundation that trains and supports activism at county levels? Wouldn't it be great if we had more Glenn Morgans at many counties? Yeah, well, I'm happy to train. This is an interesting thing. Here's the difference between left-leaning sort of people and conservatives or libertarians. So a lot of times a conservative libertarian type person, what their objective is, they're going to say, okay, I want to start an organization because I want to do activism. So they want to spend months crossing all the T's, dotting the I's, setting the structure up. And by the time they've got it all set up the way they want, the momentum for whatever it is they're trying to do kind of dissipates. And so I can't tell you how many groups like this that I have been around that got caught up in arguing over who could be king of the molehill or how much money they had to raise just to get their paperwork structured before they could start operating as an entity. Sometimes you just have to go out and start doing things. The left is much better at that. They always have been. So they're going to be more likely to jump in and just go and do things things. And they're also more likely, and I find this to be fairly efficient too, is you take over a group that's defunct or that's just not operating very well. You take it over, revitalize it, and run with that. That's what a good activist should do sometimes. That's what I did when I was in college. I actually tried to start a libertarian club on campus. It was impossible. They made the bureaucracy so ridiculous that I realized I was going to waste most of my life just trying to get the thing set up. So I thought, well, I'll just take over a group. And the College Republicans was as close to a defunct group as I could find. And I realized once I took it over, then that would give me the venue so I could rent rooms, get a budget, have an advisor, all the stuff that you need to get an organization going on campus at the time. And it really just required me to find the gal who still had the key, met me in a dark alley, handed me the key, and I never saw her again. And that's how I took over the College Republicans when I was at school originally. And we grew it into a much more interesting organization. And I offended the state Republican Party extensively in the process. But we had a really good time. It was very effective for our college campus at the time. So I am here to train people. If you got people in Clark County that want to become more effective, I'll come down. I'll put on training lessons. And a lot of this is just, it's experience transfer a little bit. And you don't have to make all the same mistakes that everyone else makes when they get going on this. I've seen all the mistakes, I believe. I've seen them all. Made most of them myself at some time or another. And so it's helpful if you can learn from that experience and just be a little bit more effective and efficient as you move forward. So I'm happy to come out and help people in Clark County or any other county in Washington State. And I even travel outside the state sometimes, but it just really depends. When it's outside of the state travel, I'll usually talk to you a little bit more about what your expectations are. Would Indian Claw ever be able to leave King and Pierce counties? From Danny S. And the answer to that is highly unlikely. How would you leave it? You have one of two ways. You either can annex your part of the county to a different county. That's a theoretical possibility. There's no real way of doing that under the state law right now, but you theoretically could do that. Or you would separate, you become a new county, right? So take King County and split it in two, or Pierce County and split it in two, or Snohomish. I mean, this has been discussed since my grandfather's era back in the probably early 1920s, 1930s timeframe. This comes up, this issue. To Phil Fortunato's credit as a state senator from the 31st District, he was actually the first person in recent times anyway, to propose a bill that would outline whatever that process would be. But the Democrats don't even want to allow that as an existing process, right? They just flat out don't even want it to be there. And it's kind of an interesting thing. I wish that that we could do that, because there should be a way to extricate yourself from corrupt city-run government. If you live rurally, you want to live rurally. There's a reason for that. And typically with the structure that occurs, whether you're in a state like Washington or Oregon or Illinois or any place in California, the urban center is able to collect enough power that then they can go and destroy the rural areas really effectively with ridiculous rules, regulations, and just dishonest sort of policies. And they don't care because they can get elected with their urban base. And so it creates this self-perpetuating cycle of destruction. I think if you look at it was Spain, if I remember right, the way the local governance worked there, the cities could only control what was going on in the cities, and the outside portion of those, the equivalent of counties, ruled themselves. And that's not how it works today. Cities will vote in the county commissioners even if 80%, 90% of the land mass and the people who live out there, because there's 49% of the people that live in the rural areas and 51% in the cities, and the cities are just out voting them, right? So, and then they don't have to suffer the consequences of their ridiculous policies. And there's no real process for that set up in Washington state law. It would be interesting if there was, and I don't think it'd be a bad idea for us to try to look at it. Jason Browning, curious where revenue from the marijuana tax is going. Our regular other taxes just keep extending and growing exponentially, and yet supposedly Washington has a shortage of funds. Well, Jason, that's not hard to figure out. We have clowns in government. Your money gets wasted through the marijuana tax, just like it does from every other tax. All your money it's mostly wasted. It's not that there aren't a few dollars that somehow navigate the obstacle course and eventually get to something that's fairly useful. Most of us would argue and agree that we want to have the bridges fixed and updated. You want to deal with traffic congestion, so you want to widen the roads or make them bigger, or repair potholes, or fix basic stuff. But when you look at how much money gets diverted en route to supposedly getting there, now I know I'm talking about the transportation budget, not the general fund when I refer to that, but it's shocking how much money gets diverted and doesn't get to its intended purpose. When people say, we just want to fund the children, that's not what they're talking about in education. If you look at the education budget, about 88% of all education dollars go to adults. That's where it goes, directly. Direct payments to adults. Now, some of those are teachers. Let's just say we like the teachers, but what about all these administrators? Because generally, the increase in administration in the education department, the people who have nothing to do with educating your kids directly, you need some there, but you don't need as much as is funded now, and they probably don't need to make $400,000 a year. So you really have an interesting dynamic here where people will say, funds kids, but that's not really where the increase just gets squandered. My wife's a public school teacher. Please don't tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about. I was on the school board for 5 years. All 4 of my kids went nominally through public school with a lot of help from their parents. And I am far more familiar with the problems in the public education than I ever really want to be. And it's sad because it's a huge amount of money gets squandered en route to the goal that they have. And a lot of policies that get implemented are designed to make it less efficient and effective as you move forward. And so it's a willful waste of funds and money as you go along. And when you look at something like Marysville School District being taken over by the state, it's not because they suddenly ran out of money. It's because of incompetent, dishonest decisions that were made there years ago. And we identified, when I say we, I was at the Freedom Foundation, and we identified the Marysville School District as one of the most likely districts to have financial trouble 10, 12 years before they ever did. And why? Because we just looked at their union contracts, and the giveaways that they had based on the tax base that they had there didn't make any sense. But they don't care, and they pass it anyway, and now the chickens come home to roost, and they're genuinely dealing with a problem. We don't have a shortage of money in Washington State. We have it spent poorly, whatever money we do collect, and raising taxes is a poor choice to make, and that happened in this circumstances. And unfortunately, it happens way, way more than it should. Let's see. What pre-filed pre-filed bills have caught your eye so far? Good question, Jason. I haven't really gotten into too many of them. I was talking to a few legislators earlier. There's some criminal justice reform, I'm going to say reform bills that I'm going to dig up to actually look at. I've had them summarized to me, but I don't really believe that until I actually look at them. Anything that Ferguson wants is certainly questionable, because usually he loves destroying the constitutional protections that people have when it comes to free speech, assembly, association. So I'm always in Second Amendment issues, so I always want to focus on anything that he supports. But a lot of things I think are going to be kind of virtue signaling bills. I don't know how much is really going to come through, but whatever does come through, this session is the one that it happens in, because the following session is much, much closer to the election time, and the elected officials, even at the state level, are aware of that, and so they're not going to want to push through bills that are quite as bad when they're actually going to be on the ballot shortly. Let's see. Thunderstriker, another question. How possible is the Democrats' plan to abolish the Electoral College? Well, I mean, it's probably unlikely. It's a conversation that's come up so often over the years, the last, say, 80 years or so. It's something that comes up periodically. There's more of a defense of the Electoral College now than there ever has been before. Remember, the Electoral College largely protects small states from just being crushed and destroyed by a handful of big states with bigger population bases. Similar to the conversation I had earlier about the way cities destroy the rural communities with willful elected abuse, essentially, with policy abuse. So anyway, we'll see how it goes. I don't find it to be likely, though. That's just my own opinion. It doesn't mean they won't make noise in that direction, but some of the wind is pulled out of the sail, because in this case, everything's about Trump on the left, and he won the popular vote as well as Electoral College, and so that kind of diminishes their interest right now. Teddy Bear got here late. Not sure if you've covered this, but is Ferguson going to fight back against immigration deportation and lose Washington the government funding like EBT college grants? My guess is he's going to go right up to the edge of whatever that looks like. Ferguson's not a complete idiot. He's corrupt and dishonest, and he's not a good guy, and he's terrible probably in every measurable way when it comes to that. However, he's not completely foolish. So I think that he goes up to that point. Maybe he pushes it to the point that they cut off some funds, and then he uses that as his campaign rallying cry, and then he reverses policy, and his virtue signaling is, I tried to stand up against Trump, but they had us over a barrel on this, and I had to reverse this policy. My guess is that's what he does, something like that. I don't know how much it would affect EBT. College grants for sure. I think the college grants are going to be affected no matter what, mainly because we certainly have some low-hanging fruit with Evergreen State College, probably Western, possibly the Confucius Institute at PLU. Some of these are going to probably drive federal. It's probably not so much college. I mean, college grants I would anticipate getting cut, but you also would be losing accreditation, so that you couldn't take out a federal loan to go to that college, and that probably is a bigger impact on those schools. Let's see. Let's see, D. Rambo, I listened to the public disclosure, and our Washington Treasury, I don't know what you're talking about that. Our Washington Treasury does not have it all open. They make your request what you're looking for, ? No, all should be available 24/7, as I'm assuming what you mean. You can't, when you file a records request, you can file a records request for anything you want, but if you want to get it in a timely manner, it's better to be a little bit focused. Washington State Treasury is not probably... I usually wouldn't go to the Treasury Department of Washington State and look there first. I think you're going to find more interesting things at the local government level most of the time, mainly because of competency and the ease of digging through the documents. The state budget is a little bit more difficult to dig through at that size, right? Billions and billions of dollars. You can use AI now to dig through some of these deep budgets. So getting really one of the things that the agencies used to do is they would just try to they would overwhelm you with records and thinking that they could hide the needle in the haystack and you'd never find the needle. And so AI has actually solved that problem to some extent. And they've got all kinds of games, they being the state agencies or local government officials, in thinking about this. And so the flood the zone strategy and how to respond to a Public Records Act or a FOIA request too doesn't really quite work the same way as it used to. So, but I do agree with you. It should be open 24/7. They should be able to provide that to us, and they certainly like to push us so that we don't get the information that we're looking for. I am going to just hit the last couple questions here because I realize I'm pushing time, and I'm not trying to keep everybody later than you probably want to be in. Let's see. I'll do this one here. Nellie, as a state becomes more divided, could Eastern Washington potentially become part of the greater Idaho movement, or is there another option you see? Well, Eastern Washington for the past, there's been mixed approaches to the attempt to separate Eastern Washington into its either own state, the state of liberty, or greater Idaho effort, which is similar to the Eastern Oregon approach that they've taken. And to some extent, some of the Northern California counties too. And either way, those are kind of similar approaches. New states being created is unusual, right? But I'm telling you, we're living in weird times right now too. And I joke about this a little bit, but I almost I was going to do a video about, when Trump joked about annexing parts of Canada, right, or all of Canada, and there are movements that in history that it does allow the expansion of new states in America. It's not been done for a long, long time, right? So nobody alive today has really got that kind of experience with it, but it's always possible we go down an unusual road where we do break in some of the states into multiple states. The history of that, though, in our country has been one of partisan divide, where the party that believes that it's going to not benefit from that process is going to fight that process tooth and nail, mainly for the Electoral College at the presidential level, but also for the Senate representation more than anything else, because you still have the representatives, for the most part, in Congress get evenly divided. And since they can't cross state boundaries, a rep could be a rep for a state with a smaller population. But what would happen is in the state, you still have 2 senators that would have to come from that state under our Constitution. And so if the belief is that that state state of Liberty, for example, in Eastern Washington, you'd have 2 elected Republican senators going to D.C. as well as probably you'd have 2 congressmen that would come from that area. So if you're a Democrat, you would just fight that tooth and nail, because the last thing you want is 2 more Senate seats that you have to fight for that you can't pick up, right? And so you would negotiate typically with the Republicans, saying, okay, then if you feel like you're forced to do it, you're going to say, then bring in Puerto Rico, and we will get Democrat senators from there and a representative from there that's a reliable Democrat vote. That's typically the argument that goes back and forth. So historically, what they would do is they would set up 2 states, figuring that one state would be Republican, one state would be Democrat, or whatever the equivalent was back in the day. So that's the kind of horse trading you aren't even aware of that goes on behind the scenes. And that's presuming you can even generate that level of interest where they think that's a possible outcome that they could have. Let's see. Yep, sorry you're dealing with that in Marysville. CJ Dewey, will we ever start actually designating money from taxes to go into separate accounts and not just into the general fund? Let me explain this to you, because this is a good question. I like it because it comes up frequently. But there's essentially only 3 practical divisions at the state level in our budget process. And this, I think, is just going to be my last detailed question here, and then I'll give us some summary. But it essentially is general fund, transportation, and capital budget. Capital budget is money that's set aside for capital projects, mostly things like buildings, infrastructure type things that are allow you to bond for them. There's a higher level of voting because you're essentially imposing future debt on future generations. And so the way our state constitution is set up, you need a higher percentage of vote to approve those. Then you have the transportation budget, which is separate because it's commingled with federal funds, and it's a legal requirement the feds have for it that money stays there, and it's only used on transportation projects. Now, longer conversation on how that's been manipulated over time, but that's the theory. And then you have general fund. Over the years, there have been hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of bills passed at this point in time that have dedicated, I'm going to put this in air quotes, dedicated funds for whatever it is, toxic waste cleanup, testing for sponge virus disease in deer, agricultural checkoffs, whatever, all kinds. I mean, just hundreds and hundreds of these little funds that exist out there. And whenever the legislature gets its back up against the wall and they decide, oh no, we need a few billion more or a couple $100 million more or whatever more that they need, they do what they call a sweep, which means they sweep all those dedicated funds out because the Democrats have decided, and this is a Democrat thing, please understand that you've mentioned to me about partisan stuff. This is 100% Democrat policy. It's always been the Republicans, at least the last half a century, who have opposed this, but Democrats have interpreted the state law in the budgeting process as to give them the authority and allowance to sweep all those funds out. So what's happened is there's been a lot of discouragement over the last 15, 20 years in the legislature with setting up these dedicated funds because they really aren't dedicated. It's a facade. It's not a real thing. Just because the bill says it's dedicated fund doesn't mean anything. It gets swept at some point in time in the future down the road when the legislature feels like they need more money and they have a better cause they want to dump it into. So these funds never accumulate in any significant degree. It's a great idea. You're not alone. There's generations of us who have wanted to do this and have it stay consistent that way, but that's not how it works. So anyway, and that's it. I think for right now, I'm going to just kind of close here with Merry Christmas to everybody. I do have a really cool video coming out that's highly unusual. It's totally different than anything I've ever done before, mainly because I had a friend of mine build a really, really cool gingerbread house, Christmas-oriented holiday. Trust me when I say that. It sounds stupid when I say it. It is really interesting. Perfect for the holidays, perfect for the seasonal political commentary that it represents. It's very interesting. It's very fun. It'll be a very visual, high-quality video. I'll be putting it out. I'm hoping end of this week on top of the other videos that I've already recorded on a couple other subjects. So hopefully it'll help you enjoy the holidays just that much more. Thank you again for all the questions that you had. I hope that I'm helpful in answering some of those. I hope I gave you some ideas if you're interested in digging up corruption in the local government where you live today. I do hope that I've given you a little bit to think about, and as you go forward, enjoy the other videos that I'm going to be launching over the next 10 days or so, getting close to Christmas, and let me know what you think about those as they come up. Feel free to share them with others. I'm hoping next year to be much more active. I'm hoping also, and we'll see if I can get around to this and do it right, I'm hoping to have some a different test and a podcast effort with some different videos I'll be filming, not in the studio, nice studio here, and we'll see if I can do it in a way that it doesn't off-put my viewers and you're actually interested in the setting and the subject. So hope all's well. Merry Christmas to you. Enjoy the holidays with your family. Enjoy the new year, and I will be back in the studio, I think the first or second week in January, whenever they open it up, and I'll be in here to record some more videos and hopefully get a lot more. We'll have a lot more to talk about at that time, and we're just in really interesting times. And look forward to seeing you then. Thank you guys so much for watching, and hope all is well, and hope you, like I said, have a Merry Christmas.